first of all, Ian Anderson, thanks for taking the time to talk to the Bath Royal Literary and Scientific Institution, which is an organisation that's been going even longer than Jethro Tull. Jethro Tull are playing the Forum in Bath on September the 17th. It's part of a tour that you're calling the Prog Rock year, or the Prog Years. Why a Prog Rock tour?
Well, I think I'm guessing maybe 50% of Jethro Tull fans and record buyers over the years, they would think of us primarily as a progressive rock band, which is the term I would use to describe Jethro Tull. It began in 1969 when the British Music Press first coined the term progressive rock and mentioned our name amongst two or three others. And I thought that's an appropriate descriptive term for what I think I'm trying to do with my life. Of course, 2 years later, progressive rock became shortened to the often derisory prog rock. And I felt a little ambivalent about that, and that led me to make an album in 1972 called Thick as a Brick, which was a bit of a spoof, a send-up of the prog rock and concept album genre. But of course, in its own way, it was inevitably a concept album, and I was hoisted by my own petard in regard to mocking and yet being mocked. But that's okay. I'm just here to be a pillar of fun, really. And we over the years then, to some people, became known as a folk rock band. And in 1987, I think we became a hard rock oblique stroke metal band when we won a Grammy in that category in the American Tinseltown Awards. We're all things to all people, but I just thought, well, let's focus on that material that I would think qualifies as progressive. But going along with the joke, I call it the Prog Years. But it is music actually going back as early as 1968. The first piece of music I wrote that I thought qualified for that, because it was a move away from Black American blues-inspired attempts to follow in those elevated footsteps. And so I became concerned to try and find ways to draw upon other influences, to find something a little more eclectic. And so it really began at the end of 1968. And then periodically through there, I think there are pieces that I would certainly describe as progressive rock, and that's what we set out to do in 2020. But we only managed to do 2 concerts in February in Spain before the pandemic hit, and a couple of weeks later we flew out to Finland to do a tour, only to find out when we arrived at the hotel in Helsinki, the government had just had a meeting and cancelled all public events, and managed to get everybody on a flight the next morning and said goodbye, and I didn't see them again until last week when we showed up in Germany to do 2 concerts there. After 1.5 years, it's a very strange experience to go back on the road very tentatively, because even now, having just this morning already booked several airline tickets and wrestled with all the aspects of itineraries and COVID passports and vaccinations and all the usual stuff and COVID testing. I mean, it's an enormous amount of paperwork to do every time. And it's so important. If you make one slip, you are well and truly, can I say buggered? Because indeed that's the way it feels.
Well, buggered into my head. So, and you've got I know you've got specific reasons to be concerned about COVID as well, haven't you? I know you can be. Well,
there are 3 of us.
But you've got this condition, haven't you?
Well, 3 of us in the band have underlying health conditions that put us into the vulnerable category, and we really, really can't afford to. The issues with being infected by the virus are twofold. Number one, which is the real priority one, short term, is that would mean we would fail a test. And if that happened when we were in another country, we truly get banged up abroad, 10 to 14 days quarantine in Germany if we failed a test on return, to before we return, which you have to do to come back to the UK. So there's a high level of risk. People might think, well, it's no risk at all. Well, it is a risk, because people do they do fail their tests, and We know people are returning from Spain a couple of weeks ago. Something like, I believe it was 2.4% of returning passengers were returned with COVID, even though they passed a test just before they left, and yet their day 2 test, PCR test, they had caught COVID. That seems to me a little worrying, really. If you're on an aeroplane, the chances are somebody on that flight, or maybe 2 people on that flight, statistically have probably got COVID, even though they may not know it. If you're playing at a festival, which I am next week in Switzerland, I have two festivals, and if we go by statistics in the UK, then we can see that at the Boardmasters Festival in Cornwall, I think it was, we were looking there at around 10% of the people who attended that festival subsequently tested positive for COVID. That's tested positive for COVID. Doesn't describe the many others who would never have reported the symptoms or just had light symptoms or even asymptomatic, but carried and could pass on the disease. So, but let's just to say what we know. 10%, roughly speaking, of the people who went to the Boardmasters Festival, 10% of the people who went to Wembley to watch those football final things, either arrived with COVID and passed it on, or got COVID while they were there and found out later. So 10%, I'm going to be facing an audience in Switzerland where, rates are on the ascendant. It's not as bad as this country, by no means. It's about half on the rolling 7-day average per 100,000 people. But nonetheless, Switzerland would cause me concern at any time, anywhere. But, we're talking about a big gathering with exactly the same testing and clarification protocols in place. They've got to either prove that they've had an antigen test. They've either got to or take one at the door, or they have the Swiss equivalent of our NHS vaccination certificate to get in. So the same kind of protocols in place as there were in these British events. But the reality is they don't catch everybody, and 10% is a hell of a lot of people. To catch COVID at a festival. I'll be backstage with hundreds of other people from, other bands and their crews and general support people and catering. And, it's a finite risk, for me to do that. And it's a finite risk for anybody. There's no point pretending, oh, we're back to normal. Oh, we're back at going on the stage and festivals and happening. Smiley. No, it is not back to normal. You are facing a very tangible risk of catching and spreading COVID, which is not done with us by a long, long way. We're facing months, if not years, of the Delta variant alone. There's no point really in discussing what happens after the Delta variant, but surely there will be other variants for which we will probably be less prepared, and the vaccines will be less capable, will be less efficacy in terms of preventing contracting the disease and spreading it. So, it's a very fragile time. And I just want to get a few concerts in at this point in my life when I think I can manage it safely enough, because my professional performing life will come to an end sometime in the next few years, whatever happens, COVID notwithstanding. So yes, of course, I am concerned, and I'm concerned for the members of my band. I'm also concerned for members of the audience, that they have as much awareness as they possibly can, and that they feel as safe as they possibly can coming to venues to see the band. And I hope that will be the case in the UK tour, where many weeks ago we were in touch with all the venues. In fact, we were in touch with the venues more than a year ago, when it's, before things got so bad, because we wanted to know what COVID protocols they had in place, both for the visiting productions, artists and crew, and for the audience. So they've had lots of time to think about this. And again, government edicts notwithstanding, most of this is common sense.
Is this the strangest period you've had in your career because of COVID? And, because it's
a strange period I've had in my life, full stop. And I think that would apply to a good many other people, many of whom are no longer here to discuss the matter. Of course, it is the most significant event in our living memories and history in terms of its impact globally and the way in which it's impacted so many people in amongst friends and family and people you know. But it's I would describe it as absolutely that. It's every bit that.
Finally managed to get back on stage. I mean, leaving aside all the problems around that now with COVID, and it's obviously a nightmare, right? Because as you say, when you're backstage, especially at a festival, so many people milling around, etc. But once you got on stage, how did it feel after that gap? Was it difficult? Was it great? What was it like?
Well, I have to say in Germany that it was very well managed. Everybody backstage was they were not wearing face coverings. They were wearing FFP2 masks, a world of difference. A difference between 10 or 20% efficacy in stopping you contracting or breathing small aerosol droplets. And, and the supposed 95% that an FFP2 mask will afford in terms of protection. And these days, the 90% of the British public, we are told, are still wearing masks. Most of them are just wearing flimsy, useless face coverings or this pale blue, skimpy surgical mask, which frankly, it's not that they're a waste of time, but they're pretty damn close to it. An FFP2 mask in sexy black used to be, at no point during the pandemic have these not been available, but our wonderful Prime Minister and his dozy advisors failed to read any of the stuff that was written back at the time of the SARS and the MERS epidemics in regard to the work that went on to study different face mask materials and how efficient they were or not. It's been out there in peer group reviewed internet land for years and years. And of course, many subsequent tests have been done to show, and I've done my own using small aerosol droplets, I won't go into that, but it is quite frankly, anything less than this, you are just being dumb, really frankly. They're less than £1 each now. So you can afford to wear 2 or 3 of these a day. It's still going to cost you less than a Starbucks coffee. No excuses.
I quite agree. And also, quite apart from the uselessness of some of the flimsier masks, people tend to wear them below their nose, which I find utterly...
Well, exactly, because unless you're indulging in, playing a flute or singing or a furious conversation with somebody, 90% of your breathing is done through your nose. If you're at rest, you're breathing through your nose. I'm not right now because I'm talking, so I'm intaking breath through my mouth as I would have as if I was singing or playing the flute. But if I'm sitting here at the computer, it's all through the nose. So do people not stop to think, well, what I'm breathing in actually is, and what I'm breathing out is unmasked. If I'm wandering through the aisles of the supermarket, I may have the mask on here, but it's not actually in any way ameliorating the effects of my breathing in or out. And I rather think that more these days, more people are wearing masks, those that are wearing masks, because they want to protect themselves. So for God's sake, go online, learn about it, go to Amazon.com and buy yourself some FFP2 masks. They're widely available. They have been since the beginning of the pandemic. I've had face masks in my hand luggage for 15 to 20 years. I mean, it's just something I've always done because of those occasions when I might have a cold or might be fearful amongst other people coughing and sneezing. It's just common sense. And I really do feel that anybody who thinks, oh, well, mask wearing is behind us because Boris says we don't need to do it anymore. He's a chump. He should be much more responsible in telling people, not just advising them, but advising them what to wear. I honestly do feel there is an absolute intellectual blockage in the minds of our politicians and their advisors, or it's all done for political and economic expediency, which is not acceptable when people's lives are at stake. Tell the fucking truth. I am so pissed off with the lack of clear and accurate information that has come, from our government. As I say, in Germany, they all wear FFP2 masks. It's actually law in most of the states of Germany, or certainly the ones I know about, that you have to wear an FFP2 or an FFP3 mask. Face coverings or surgical masks are not acceptable.
Yeah.
And so what is it they know that we don't? And bearing in mind their infection rates are a fraction of what ours are, and continue to be, and will doubtless continue to grow as we move into the winter months with children back at school, etc. The pandemic is not over. This is a rap on the knuckles and a bit of a warning in terms of what we're likely to face again this year, with the number of people who are not vaccinated, with the breakthrough that we're seeing amongst the double vaccinated in terms of still being infected and passing it on. And those who argue, oh, well, it's all about hospital admissions and deaths. Well, frankly, they've been continuing to go up now for many, many weeks. So we can't pretend that that we have, what was the word they use? Oh, we've broken the link between infections and hospitalizations and death. No, we didn't. In fact, when briefly the infection rates were going down, hospital and death rates were still going up. We hadn't broken it. We'd actually reinforced it. What kind of double talk is that? It's utterly spurious and insulting to any of us who've got a bit of a brain.
I mean, Delta has been causing enough problems, as you've mentioned. Who knows what Epsilon has in store for us?
No, and I have yet to read any kind of meaningful analysis of why Delta used to be called the Indian variant. That's where it seemed to have originated in India, with massive infections, huge underreporting of infections and deaths. We know that now, going back into 2020 and particularly into the early part of 2021. But the fact remains that India, unless it is, insidiously underreporting now, it would appear that infection rates and death rates have gone remarkably down in India. Why, given the Indian variant's ability to be far more transmissible, why is that happening if those published rates are even halfway correct? And I don't understand why that is. Is it just that in India they have an acquired immunity through infection that has brought them not to this absurd notion of herd immunity, which has always been a load of bollocks. It is a convenient way of describing a phenomenon in regard to infection. It is not applicable in the real world, particularly in regard to COVID-19. So all this nonsense about herd immunity, or equally nonsense about COVID zero policies like New Zealand, it is just plain silly. So going back to the issue with India, why is it that somehow it looks like they turned the corner? Is this all acquired immunity? It can't be innate immunity, because they had infections every bit as bad as we did when we were unprepared for COVID. So that to me is quite interesting. Is it simply about having contracted the disease and survived, that you now have a better immunity against the Delta variant? And are many of the people who are currently being infected, having been vaccinated already, or having caught COVID already, maybe months or a year ago, would have a degree of acquired immunity against the original variants, but not Delta? So, there are a lot of subtleties and difficulties. And since we are intent globally on pursuing only real-world analysis of these situations, rather than doing live human challenge trials, for which many people, including me, volunteered, to actually be human guinea pigs under very controlled circumstances. But nonetheless, that's the only way you can get answers. Perhaps in 3 to 4 weeks, you could get some pretty serious answers as to the effectiveness both of vaccines and the degree to which innate and acquired immunity from whatever source, would ameliorate the Delta variants. But nobody will do live human challenge trials. It just seems everybody go, oh, no, can't do that. Oh, no, Hippocratic oath. No, we're not allowed to infect people. So let's just infect animals instead.
Yeah.
Come on.
Yeah.
They have a life too. Nobody stops to think. Well, few of us stop to think about live challenge testing on animals, or vivisection, or the hideous things that go on in animal trials. And we are an animal species too. It's I personally feel we should be doing that, and there've been plenty of volunteers in many countries. How did you volunteer? Well, if you remember back at the time of the initial early discussions about vaccine trials, especially with the AstraZeneca vaccine at Oxford, there were websites where you could put your name down for trialing. And I did that twice. The first time I think I got a reply in a nice way, but just sort of saying, well, we're not actually doing trials with this age group yet. In other words, bugger off, oldie. and then the second time, I don't think I got a reply at all, because I heard they were now moving, the goalposts a little bit for testing to include the elderly, and but that didn't work out. And then there was another website which was gathering, sort of petition volunteers for doing live human trials to test the efficacy of vaccines, and you could sign up for it. But again, that wasn't a government or an official thing. This was a body of well-meaning people saying, "Come on, let's see if we can get the answers quickly, and for the benefit of humankind, we will take a calculated, hopefully small risk in regard to being deliberately infected, because we don't even yet know the number of virus particles that will cause an infection to blossom. We just don't have that information. There's been guesstimates about that going again back to SARS and MERS days, but in terms of COVID, as far as I'm aware, there have been no actual quantitative tests done on the amount of virus particles that will cause infection. Obviously, then you've got the myriad of subcategories of people of different ages. Have they been vaccinated or not? Have they been previously infected or not? But, to try and get information, I don't personally feel that until we do live human challenge trials, we're never going to be able to cope with these things. It's going to be, we were talking optimistically about a few months of real world field trials. Here we are a year and a half later, and we still don't have the information that we need in order to better plan future vaccine production, in order to better plan going to Tenerife on your holidays,
Well,
let alone flying away to do a concert at a foreign festival. So that's that's the situation we're in. Yes, a lot of uncertainty, and I have been for a year and a half doing hours and hours every day working in the office, planning, checking flights, tour itineraries, doing all that stuff, and been disappointed week after week after week when not a week has gone by when we've not had to either postpone once or even now postpone a second time into a. So some of the concerts we took money for back in 2019, with tickets were on sale. It's going to be 2022 currently before those concerts might take place.
But you're right. I mean, this story's got a long way to run, I think, yet. But
yeah, well, at least it keeps us amused. That and Scandinavian Noir are my two saviors. One is knowing everything I can about COVID. It's a useful pastime and hobby, is to learn about sciences and virology and immunology. I mean, I have that kind of a mind. So, I mean, I'm fascinated by it all. But fascinated because very much it affects me, my band, my crew, my family, audiences. It's something I feel an obligation to try and know as much about as I can without ever taking any single source as gospel, because if there's one bit of information I get, I cross-check with several others to the point of looking to make sure that it is not, simply copy and paste, which the world is so full of. So you've got to always check that the language that is slightly different, as well as the semantic. You've got to check that the actual language doesn't look, hey, sure I read that phrase on this other one that I looked at. Oh, okay, yeah, another journalistic cop-out.
Has it kind of come into your songwriting in any way for future albums or songs?
I think it's a little too raw as a subject. People who've lost their parents, grandparents, or even children. It's a raw subject to deal with at the moment. I'm not something I intend to write about, but I think you can, in a more oblique way, you could introduce elements that are to do with the effects of COVID and lockdown. The effects of being materially ill or losing a loved one, or being lonely, or being in a position where you're kind of imprisoned in, under your own bed because you couldn't go out. Those are more universal topics. I mean, you can take something as an initial theme, but then you can choose to deal with it in not a literal way. You can then look at the subject in a way that is perhaps has more more ways in which it's applicable to other people's lives. And so that is a way of writing, perhaps a way of writing about COVID without saying the C word.
Indeed, indeed. So as well as sort of researching COVID for very good reasons, as well as curiosity, and watching Scandi Noir, I think you said. Did you? Was the silent singing project? Was that something that you did during lockdown, or does that predate that? And I should just say, for the benefit of those who don't know, so Silent Singing is a book you're bringing out, which is the complete lyrics of the full Jethro Tull 50 plus.
Yeah, it's about 285 songs or something, all meticulously listened to on multiple occasions to try and transcribe, because quite often the lyrics were never written down. And some of my old books that I have that have some of the lyrics in, I changed them when I went then to sing it in the studio. You know, I'd sing a different word or write a new chorus at the last minute and then toss it in the bin. So everything had to be really researched, many hours of work to do that. But it was a bit of a vanity project that I think goes back to 2016. But I didn't really start work on it, you know, really properly. I think I did a little bit in early 2020, but it was really brought to conclusion in the early months of this year. Just in the same way as making a new album, you know, that began in 2017, but pressure of tours and so on meant that I kept intending to come back to it. I'd only finished 4 songs and recorded 7 backing tracks. But during 2020, I was still hoping there would be a time when the band could get in the studio together and we could actually finish it. But that was not going to be. And so again, in the earlier months of this year, I thought, I'm just going to have to get this done without the band. So the remaining 5 songs I recorded on my own, and some of them sent their little additions, you know, from via the internet. They recorded their parts at home, and I slotted them into the multi-track mix, and finished that work, I suppose, about 2 months ago, and. But with the inevitability of the record companies all these days know how important those few thousand vinyl sales are, which are a higher margin of profit and very much sought after, particularly from bands who've got a long-term fan base. They don't want to release a CD now and a vinyl record a year later, but the waiting time to get vinyl pressed these days, which I guess many people simply are unaware of, is I mean, it used to be a week in days gone by. You'd finish your records, ship it down to wherever the EMI cutting rooms and glaze factory was in eastern suburbs of London.
It was in Walford because my uncle used to work there pressing records.
Oh, right. Yeah. Well, but you know, I mean, if Cliff had a new single, it would be released, you know, 2 or 3 days later, because things were, you know, the masses of pressing plants, or pressing machines and cutting lathes and so on. But these days, they are so few and far between, because we're using technology that is 50 to 60 years old, and the equipment is 50 or 62 years old, because they haven't made a Neumann cutting lathe, to my knowledge, in the last 50 years. So this is all ancient equipment, lovingly maintained and restored, and here and there bits are pirated from other broken down machines or whatever to try and keep things running. But it now takes, we're looking at usually around 7 to 8 months to get a vinyl record pressed. You've got to book it in, and this is with the majors. You know, that if you want to have a full run of a vinyl album, you know, you're in a queue, and you are big customers, you have big priorities, but they have to manage their release schedule as well, because all their artists are screaming, saying, we want it released next week. You know, I being one of them. But it's just not possible. So we're looking at a January 2022 release, which is not quite 5 years after I started work on the album. It's ridiculous.
I hadn't really thought about the vinyl pressing side of things, but that's amazing. Going back to the silent singing, when you looked back through your lyrics, and by the way, so let me know when you're running out of time.
Yeah, well, I've actually got a 9:30, which is now, so I'm afraid we are. It's my fault for talking too long about things you didn't want to talk about, but it had to be my open ear for. One quick last question.
Yeah, what did you learn from going back through your lyrics of 50 years?
Well, I learned not to be embarrassed about them in the way that I expected I would. I mean, the earlier lyrics, I thought there's going to be some real clangers in there that I'm just going to feel so embarrassed about. But I know I can't make the claim that it's the complete, pantheon of Jethro Tull and Ian Anderson lyrics if I leave some out because I think they're a bit naff. So I had to put them in. But I have to say that it probably came down to 2 or 3 that I went, cringe. That a lot of the things that I felt uneasy about, I actually, when I read them on the page, I thought, well, they're actually okay. I really don't feel embarrassed about them. They are what they are, and some of them are a little simplistic or naive. Some of them are a little overblown and complicated, but, by and large, I felt pretty good about it. So as a body of, it's not too bad.
Did I read somewhere that you had, I might have this wrong, but I also once read that you didn't have much time for poetry, or you didn't like your lyrics being thought of as poetry. Because I've always thought there's such a literary, lyrical quality to your writing, your lyrics writing.
Well, there are 2 things about poetry. Number one is, I find a lot of it very pretentious that I have dipped in and out of over the years. But secondly, it's the way that it's presented. There is there are 2 or 3 traditions as to layout of poetry, in terms of printing, and I don't like any of them. I particularly dislike the capitalizing the first letter of each line, regardless of its grammar and context in the greater body, and finishing off, and there to be virtually no punctuation anywhere in a line, and no comma, no full stop at the end of a line. It basically disobeys all the rules of grammar. I tried to find, when I did this, a compromise between having things that were grammatically as correct as I could make them without it being overloaded with semicolons and colons and other, formulaic ways of breaking up what otherwise would be gobbledygook lines. The other thing is that as a singer, when you're singing, you often find it, I, as a writer and a singer, I very often, I will have a line, a sentence, if you like, which has no subject. Sometimes it has no verb. It is grammatically incorrect to start with, but nonetheless, you have to accept that there are things that you will do that are rather like painting a picture. You have elements there that don't necessarily always follow the rules, either the painterly rules of line, form, tone, color, etc., or in literary terms that they are perfect English grammar. But I tried to find that compromise, and I certainly didn't want to do some 19th century romantic kind of poetry way of writing it out to make it look like conventional poetry, because I don't regard my lyrics as poetry. I regard them as song lyrics, something I sang in the studio, something I sang on stage in many cases. So for me, it's not to disparage poetry, but I really do like to, that's why it's called silent singing. When I was listening to it all, I'm listening to the music and kind of silently singing along with it to go through the words in my head. And I think other people, the way I would love them to read the book is to, put on the music and play that in the background while they're reading the book and reading through, rather like subtitles in a Scandinavian Noir. I'll leave you with that thought.
Ian Anderson, thank you so much for taking the time to talk to the
That's a pleasure.
Literary and Scientific Institution. We'll all look forward to seeing you in Bath on September the 17th at the Forum.
Indeed, yeah, the first show of a UK tour. Take care.
Thanks, Ian. Take care.
Cheers.
Bye-bye.
Bye.